He always thought fear was something loud, something that screamed in your ears or froze your feet in the middle of a storm. But fear isn't loud. Fear is quiet. It's the soft voice that says, not today, maybe later. It's the gentle whisper that says, what if you fail? It's the invisible force that builds walls inside your own mind and paints them as safety. And he didn't even realize how much of his life had been shaped by Ith. Wasn't afraid of monsters. He was afraid of himself, afraid of his own voice, afraid of trying and being seen trying, afraid of what people would think if he failed in public. He smiled when he didn't want to. He nodded when he should have spoken. He stayed still when he should have moved. He had big dreams, but fear convinced him that dreams were for other people, not for someone like him. For years he lived that way, not miserable, just numb. He had mastered the art of staying in the middle, not too high, not too low, safe, controlled, predictable, but deep inside, he knew he was shrinking, not physically, but spiritually, his confidence, his courage, his curiosity, all fading slowly, like a candle losing oxygen. He had replaced boldness with comfort, and he called it maturity. But comfort is not peace, it's quiet destruction. It doesn't yell, it erodes, and the worst part is it feels normal, until one day something cracks, not outside, inside, and for him that crack came on an ordinary day. No tragedy, no huge event, just a moment. He was sitting at a small cafe, watching people walk by. A man at the next table was telling his friend about quitting his job to start a business. His voice was filled with uncertainty, but also fire, and as he spoke, something hit him like a punch to the chest. That man was afraid to, but he was still moving that night. He couldn't sleep, not because of the man's story, but because of his own, or rather, the lack of one. He started asking himself questions he had avoided for years. Why am I playing so small? Why do I always wait? Why do I keep living like I have a second life? In the bank, and with every question came one answer. Fear, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of looking foolish, fear of disappointing others. Fear of becoming someone others wouldn't recognize. It was exhausting, and it was silent. He had built a cage with invisible walls and locked himself inside, and the key was in his hand the whole time. But fear convinced him it didn't exist. The next morning, something changed. Not his life, not his story, just a thought, a sentence, a decision. He said to himself, I'm tired of being scared of shadows. I want to be free. And it wasn't a dramatic change. He didn't shout it to the world. He didn't post it online. He just started walking differently, slower, straighter, not to impress, but to remember what it feels like to choose himself. He began doing small things that scared him, speaking up in meetings, saying no without guilt, asking questions without fear of sounding dumb, making eye contact. It wasn't about the actions. It was about reclaiming power. Every time he did something fear told him not to, he felt a little more alive, and for the first time in years, he felt momentum, not big wins, but internal shifts. He realized fear doesn't die in one battle, it dies in 1,000 small acts of courage. Every time you walk through it, even if your voice shakes, even if your hands tremble, you shrink its power, and grow your own. But the world didn't applaud his changes. No one gave him a trophy for showing up with courage. Most people didn't even notice. That's when he learned something powerful. Success is never about what the world sees, it's about what you survive in silence. What you choose when no one is clapping. That's where real transformation begins in. So he kept going. He used to think courage was loud, something heroic, something dramatic. But now he knew better. Courage is quiet. It happens in the dark. When you get up from the floor after falling, for the 100th time, when you send the email even though your heart's racing, when you say no to comfort knowing it might hurt. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to move while fear is still screaming in your head. He started to understand that fear never really goes away. It evolves. It hides in new places, in new decisions, in new people. But once you stop treating it like a wall and start treating it like a signal, everything changes. Fear stopped being the enemy. It became the compass. Wherever it showed up, he walked toward it, slowly, intentionally, because he learned one truth. The life you want is on the other side of what you're scared to face. There were days when nothing seemed to work, when he took the risk and failed, when his voice cracked in public, when his effort didn't bring the reward. But now he didn't collapse. He didn't retreat. He didn't say, I knew I shouldn't have tried. Because even in failure, he had done something new. He had shown up, and sometimes that's more powerful than success. Showing up despite the fear, that's how you build real confidence. People around him started noticing something. Not his results, his energy, the way he walked, The way he looked to them in the eye. The way he no longer made excuses for his dreams. They saw someone who wasn't running anymore, not from others, not from his own reflection. And that shook some people. Not everyone celebrates your growth. Some people liked you better when you were small. He understood that too. Growth creates distance. It's not personal. It's natural. He stopped chasing approval. Stopped shrinking. To stay relatable, he wasn't trying to be better than anyone. He was just trying to be better than the version of himself who kept waiting. He started journaling every morning. One question: what is fear trying to stop me from doing today? And every time he answered it, he promised himself to do that one thing, even if badly, even if nervously, even if it didn't work. Because that's how you train your brain to stop seeing fear as a stop sign and start seeing it as a doorway. He didn't always feel ready, but he showed up anyway. On days he wanted to disappear, he stood tall. On days his mind screamed, "You're not enough," he answered back, "Then I'll grow." That's when he learned confidence isn't something you feel first. It's something you earn through action. You build it in the doing, in the mess, in the doubt, in the sweat. The world outside didn't change much. His city still looked the same. His apartment still echoed some nights. His friends still asked him why. He was working so hard when no one was watching. But inside he was becoming unstoppable. Not because he had no fear, but because he was tired of being controlled by ETH. Started taking opportunities he would have ignored before. Small speaking gigs, new side hustles, difficult conversations. He started showing people who he really was. And some people didn't get it. Some people walked away. But for the first time he was okay with that. He would rather lose people than lose himself again. One night, alone on his balcony, he looked up at the sky, the city lights below, the stars above, and he smiled. Not because life was perfect, but because he wasn't hiding anymore. He had chosen truth over comfort, action over excuses, courage over fear, and in that moment he didn't feel powerful because everything had worked out. He felt powerful because he had changed the one thing that mattered most, his mindset. He didn't become fearless overnight. There were still days when doubt whispered louder than belief. Still moments when he questioned everything. Still nights when sleep wouldn't come because the mind kept asking what if. But something had shifted. It wasn't the absence of fear that marked his growth. It was his response to it. He no longer let fear have the final word. He could speak, but it couldn't decide. That shift was everything. The first time he stood on stage, his hands trembled. Not from weakness, but from power building inside a body that once stayed silent. He wasn't the most charismatic. He didn't have the perfect story, but he had truth, and truth cuts through noise. People didn't clap because he was flawless. They clapped because he was real, because he spoke about fear like an old friend he had learned to outgrow. He started receiving messages from strangers, from friends he hadn't spoken to in years. They all said the same thing: "I thought I was the only one feeling like that." That's when he understood: when you confront your fear publicly, you give others permission to confront theirs. Your courage becomes contagious. Your story becomes someone else's survival guide. But the shift wasn't just external. Internally, something deeper was happening. He stopped measuring progress by trophies. He started measuring it by recovery time. How fast he bounced back from failure. How long he stayed stuck after rejection. How quickly he remembered who he was when life tried to make him forget. That's real growth. Not how high you climb, but how deep your roots grow. He began his mornings with silence. No noise, no distractions, just breath, and a question. What would I do today if I wasn't afraid? Then he would do it. Maybe not perfectly, but he would start. Fear hates action. It feeds on hesitation. Every time you move, you starve it. Every time you show up, you steal its power. People started seeing him differently. Some said he was brave. Some said he changed. But he hadn't become someone else. He had just removed everything that wasn't really him. The masks, the fear, the filters. And what was left was raw, honest, powerful. That's what happens when you stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be free. Opportunities began to appear. Not because of luck, but because of energy. Fear dims your light. Courage makes you visible. When he walked into a room now, people felt it. Not because he was loud, but because he was present, fully. No apologies, no shrinking. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He was just being. But success brought its own fears. Fear of losing it, fear of being seen, fear of responsibility. New level, new devils. But he didn't panic. He smiled, because he finally knew how to fight. He had a system, a rhythm. When fear showed up, he didn't run. He leaned in, listened, and then acted anyway. He sat quietly in his room, the soft hum of the night around him. The window was open. letting in a slow breeze. A single lamp lit his desk, casting shadows on the wall, and in front of him, an old notebook, the same notebook he had once used to hide his doubts. Now it was his mirror, a place where his fears had names, and his victories had scars. He flipped through the pages, and with each one he remembered how far he'd come. The boy who once hesitated to raise his hand now stood on stages. The man who once whispered his dreams to himself now spoke them into microphones. But even now, when things looked stable, when people praised him, there were moments, quiet moments, when the old fear knocked again. It never truly leaves. It just learns new tricks. This time, it whispered, "What if this is temporary? What if they find out you're not really that strong? What if this all falls apart?" He closed the book and stood up. He didn't argue with the voice. He didn't fight it. He just breathed, because he knew something now that he didn't know back then. You don't defeat fear by pretending it's not there. You defeat fear by moving. With it, you learn to walk beside it without letting it walk ahead of you. Fear can follow, but it doesn't lead, and so he kept leading. Every morning, he wrote one truth, something he believed even when his voice shook, something that grounded him, that reminded him who he was becoming, and slowly, those truths became armor. Not to shield him from pain, but to remind him he could take the hit and still stand. He started helping others, not with perfect answers, but with his story, his failures, his first steps, his almost give up. He spoke in schools, in small groups, on podcasts, and he never started with how much he had achieved. He always started with who he used to be, because that's what made it real. That's what gave people hope. Not that he was fearless, but that he had learned how to move anyway. He remembered a woman who came up to him after one of his talks. She was shaking, eyes full of tears. She said, "I've been stuck for 17 years, but tonight, I think I can finally take one step," and that hit him harder than applause ever could. That's when he truly understood the weight of overcoming fear. It's not just for you, it's for the people you haven't even met yet. Your courage becomes their permission. He went back home that night, sat on the same balcony, looked at the same stars, and he smiled again. But this time, it was different. This time, he smiled with purpose, because he knew this wasn't about one speech, one project, one goal. This was life, real life, the kind that doesn't get easier, but makes you stronger, the kind where success isn't the trophy, it's the moment you choose to keep going. And so he kept going. He started taking cold showers at dawn just to train his mind to do hard things. He deleted distractions, spent less time explaining himself, more time building. He wrote down his fears, read them out loud, and laughed. Not because they weren't real, but because they no longer had chains. They were just words. And he had chosen action one day. Someone asked him, "How did you become fearless?" He paused, then said, "I didn't. I became familiar with fear, and I stopped letting it vote on my life." That sentence spread faster than he expected. People started quoting it, sharing it, sending it to friends. But to him, it wasn't a quote. It was survival. It was truth. It was earned through pain, through silence, through nights when walking away would have been easier than staying in the fight. He started building a new life, one brick at a time. No shortcuts, no faking. Every relationship in his life shifted. Some fell away, some grew deeper, because when you stop living from fear, you become a mirror. You reflect people's excuses, their delays, their own cages. Some people aren't ready to see that, and that's okay. You're not here to convince. You're here to walk your path. His mornings were disciplined. His nights were peaceful. Not because he had mastered life, but because he had mastered his choices. He chose to act. He chose to speak. He chose to fall and stand and fall again. And that's when the shift became permanent. Fear didn't vanish, but it stopped being the boss. And now, whenever someone asks him where to begin, he always says the same thing. Start with the thing you're afraid of. Not the biggest thing. Just one small fear, and defeat it. Then pick the next, and the next. Until one day you look in the mirror and see someone you never imagined could exist. Not someone without fear, but someone who became stronger than it. That's the shift. That's the real success. Not the money. Not the praise. Not the followers. The moment you realize fear may always walk beside you, but it no longer walks ahead. He woke up one morning, not with excitement, but with clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't come from books or speeches, but from doing the work. From showing up, falling down, and standing again so many times that the noise inside finally quiets. He didn't feel like someone extraordinary, but he knew something most people didn't, that courage doesn't look like a superhero. It looks like the tired man who chooses to try again. He looked in the mirror that morning and didn't recognize his old self. Not because his face had changed, but because the weight behind his eyes was gone. The doubt, the apology, the hesitation, it had all been replaced by something deeper, a sense of knowing, not knowing what the future held, but knowing who he was becoming. That was more powerful than any plan. He packed his bag and left home that day with no destination in mind, just the desire to breathe differently, to feel the world with open skin. He walked into a nearby park, sat on a bench, and watched people move. Each face told a story, and in that moment he remembered something. Everyone is afraid, but only a few are doing it anyway. And that's what separates the ordinary from the awakened day. Boy ran past him, laughing, full of life. No fear of falling, no worry about judgment, just motion, just joy. And that's when he realized something that hit him harder than all the books he'd ever read. We're not born afraid, we learn fear. From silence, from criticism, from failure, from comparison. But if fear can be learned, it can also be unlearned. And that became his mission. He started writing more, not for an audience, but to clear the dust from his soul. He wrote letters to his younger self, to the boy who wanted to sing but stayed quiet, to the teenager who loved deeply but never said it, to the young man who wanted more but settled for less. And as he wrote, the fear began to bleed out through ink. It lost its shape. It became a story, one he had survived. He started building things, not just goals, but moments, experiences. He took solo trips, sat at new tables, learned from strangers, and in every new place he asked the same question: what would I do right now if fear wasn't watching me? Then he did it. Maybe awkwardly, maybe slowly, but always with heart. And slowly, the gap between who he was and who he wanted to be disappeared. He met people who lived in fear, just like he once did, and he didn't judge them because he understood. Fear is like fog. When you're inside it, you think the whole world is gray. But when you walk through it, even a little, you realize the sky was always blue. You just had to keep walking. One man told him, I want to start over, but I'm too old. He smiled and replied, fear doesn't check your birth certificate. It only checks your will. A woman said, I've failed so many times, I don't think I have it in me to try again. And he looked into her eyes and said, the fact that you're still here means you've already won the battle 99% gave up on. He became a student again, not in school, in life, in fear. He studied himself, studied his reactions. Every time fear rose, he paused, asked why, dug into it. He wanted to understand its roots. Because if you know your fear, you can starve it. But if you avoid it, it grows in the dark and feeds on your silence. He learned that fear often disguises itself as logic. It says, be realistic. It says, maybe later. It says, you're not ready. But deep down, he knew the truth. Fear doesn't want you to be safe. It wants you to be small. And he had no room left for smallness. He built a life now on courage, on small, consistent acts of bravery, waking up early, saying what needed to be said, walking into unknown rooms, asking questions, apologizing, forgiving, loving, letting go, starting over. Every one of these things was once terrifying. Now they were his rhythm, and, as the sun set that day and the sky turned gold, he sat quietly again, this time not with confusion, but with peace, because he understood now that fear had been the greatest teacher of his life, not because it taught him how to hide, but because it taught him how to rise. He stood in a quiet room once again. No applause, no audience, just him and the echoes of the choices he had made, the ones that scared him, the ones that stretched him, the ones that changed him. And for the first time he didn't feel like a man fighting fear. He felt like a man who had walked with it long enough to know its patterns, its voice, its tricks. He wasn't afraid of being afraid anymore. He thought about all the moments where fear had nearly won, the opportunities he almost missed, the people he never approached, the dreams he almost buried, all because of a voice that had no body, no face, just wait. And then he smiled, because he realized that every breakthrough he ever experienced didn't come from a day where everything felt easy. It came from a day where fear screamed the loudest and he moved anyway. He remembered standing on the edge of a decision that could have changed nothing or everything. The kind where no one could advise you, where you can't Google the answer, where the only guide is your gut. And on that day he chose to trust himself, not because he knew how things would end, but because he was tired of living like he didn't exist. People asked him now, how did you become who you are? He never said books, or podcasts, or mentors. He said one word: repetition. He did hard things again and again until they stopped feeling like pain and started feeling like proof. Proof that he was alive, that he was growing, that he was still in the game. He remembered how it all started. Just a decision, a sentence, a moment of defiance. That he would no longer let fear sit in the front seat of his life. And now, years later, the ripple was clear. His confidence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, steady, anchored, the kind that makes storms feel like tests instead of threats. He helped others rise now, not from a place of perfection, but from scars, from experience, from empathy. He knew what it was like to wake up and not believe in yourself. He knew what it was like to watch your life from the outside, wondering when you'd finally step in and take control. And so he didn't teach people how to be fearless. He taught them how to walk with fear without giving it the steering wheel. He gave talks now, but he never shared success stories. He shared decision stories. The moment he picked himself, the day he quit something safe, the hour he cried and still showed up, because that's what people need, not the ending, the middle, the mess, the moment where it hurts but you move anyway. That's the fire people are waiting to touch. He stood once more at his old neighborhood, the street that raised him, the corners where he once stood frozen, and he looked around with a soft heart. He wasn't angry at his past. He was proud of it, because without those moments of hiding, of doubt, of silence, he wouldn't have learned the language of rising. He placed his hand on his chest, felt the heartbeat, the rhythm that had carried him through it all. And in that beat he found something priceless. Power, not the kind that controls others, but the kind that owns yourself. Fully, loudly, silently. And when he walked away from that street, he wasn't just a man who had overcome fear. He was a man who had learned to dance with it. And that changed everything, because, in the end, success doesn't look like fear disappearing. It looks like you're not being owned by it anymore. It looks like choosing the voice that lifts instead of limits. It looks like action in the face of anxiety. It looks like love in the face of loss. It looks like standing tall, even if your knees are shaking. And when people asked what's the secret, he told them the truth. There is no secret, just moments. Moments when you stop waiting, stop shrinking, stop listening to fear like it's the truth. And you finally, fully, bravely, begin.